Hey, welcome to 516 Students Truth Talk. Bunch and Kailey here, where we are answering some of your questions and just talking about some reality of things going on in our world. Recently, we had a Truth Talk where we talked about how far is too far and boundaries. And this is kind of a continuation of that, because whenever we talked about our boundaries, we have talked about how some of us may have already gone too far, and maybe we went beyond the boundaries, maybe because we didn't know the boundaries, we were forced out of the boundaries, just didn't know better, right? And so what we also have to realize whenever we are outside of those boundaries, or maybe we have gone too far, there's a big aspect that I think is very important, and what we want to touch on today is that God's grace is always bigger, always more supreme, and what we need to know about God's grace. So.
Definitely. So here's the deal. If we went too far, if we crossed those boundaries, then, yes, that was a sin. Yes, there may be earthly consequences for it. But, yes, you are still loved by God. You are still valued by God. Your identity is still found in Him and not that sin. And you are still loved and valued by your community. You're not isolated from that. And so what usually happens when we kind of cross these sexual boundaries, it feels like such a personal and just like a deep, dirty sin that Satan loves to tell you that you should just be ashamed, that you should be alone, that your identity is now found in your sin rather than who Jesus tells you you are. He tells you you're not worthy of love, you're not worthy of community, and just ostracizes you based on shame over this one sin. But exactly like what you were saying, none of our sin is too much for God. Our sin's not too much for people who love God, who want to be in community with us. And all those are just lies of shame from Satan. And so we know that our value and our identity are only found in Jesus, and they cannot be changed by our sins and by our shortcomings. We know that Jesus nailed every single one of our sins, including our sexual sins, to the cross, and they're never too much for Him. And so we know in Colossians 2:13 through 14, it's one of my favorite scriptures. It says, "In you, who were dead in trespasses of your sin, God made alive together with Him, having forgiven us all of our trespasses, all of our sins, by canceling the record of debt that stood against us. This He set aside and nailed it to the cross." That's all of our sins. There's no sin too big that should cause you to feel the shame that Satan tries to make you believe, to where you feel alone, unlovable, or that your identity is only in that sin. It's not true.
Yeah. Years ago, I struggled with that, and my mishaps and my sin. I held a lot of things over my head, and I asked myself the questions: how could God forgive me? How could others forgive me? How could even my future spouse forgive me for the sins and the things that I did? And oftentimes when we do wrong, there's a good chunk of us that we know we're doing wrong, but we do it anyway. And but that doesn't mean we have to hold things over our heads. And I think so many of us do that whenever we know that we've done wrong, or when we have done wrong. It may not have even been our fault necessarily all the time. The reality is we don't have to hold anything. The thing we have to realize, God doesn't hold anything over us. And if God is the one that created us, and the one that created us doesn't hold anything over us, then why should we feel the weight or feel like we're holding things over ourselves? And why can't we forgive others in the midst of all that, right? And so what I've learned is whenever I actually truly called on God, whenever He was just screaming at me, revealing Himself to me in multiple avenues with people in my life, and pastors in my life, and parents in my life, and just everyone, just trying to say, it's okay. It's okay to mess up. It's okay to do that, and forgiveness is here. And when I actually called on God and realized that His grace was as big as it was, that His love for me was as big as it was, that His mercy was as big as it was for me, His forgiveness was as big as it was for me, and ultimately when I had a community of people around me saying that truth, is when I really began to see that God was who He says He is, and who He claims to be. And a verse that kind of came to me in the midst of all of this transition in my life from weighing down into sin and feeling like, okay, man, is God's grace really real? The verse that kind of came to me is in Ephesians chapter 2, where it says, "But God is so rich in mercy, and He loved us so much that even though we were dead because of our sins, He gave us life when He raised Christ from the dead. And it is only by God's grace that we've been saved." And whenever, I've heard that over and over again in my life, but whenever I truly sat down and I truly had the amount of people in the community around me pointing me to that truth, and all of a sudden, like, I believed it, like whenever we have people constantly saying, "I love you, you are loved, you are valued," then we begin to feel loved and valued and important and significant. So more times than not, when we fall into temptation, we think we aren't good enough when we mess up. When it's the opposite, like God's grace is ever so big, ever so sufficient. That's all we truly need. And whenever we have other people that rally in with us, that is what we need. Community is important, and it's whenever we have that community, we begin to see and realize and believe that God is who He says He is, that He loves us, and that His grace is all we need. And so community is important. And so we want you to know community is important. We want you to know that you can have community here with us. Our student ministry, our leaders love you because we've experienced this grace that God has to offer. And we know that the best way we can have that is in community with others. And when we believe that and are all about that. So come join us Sunday mornings here at Christ Church, 11:15 in the attic, and you can experience that community and that grace that God has to offer.